it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. And Tara Murphy, in fact, is currently an associate professor, was promoted recently, and so I'm sure before very long she'll be another professor in the School of Physics. So Tara was actually an undergraduate student here, and the first in her family to go to university. And after her undergraduate, she went to Edinburgh to do her PhD. And she works in radio astronomy. So she came back to Australia and worked for a while at CSIRO, and then she came to the University of Sydney about 10 years ago on a fellowship and was appointed as a lecturer, and now, as I said, she's an associate professor. Now, Tara has actually two areas of expertise. One of them is radio astronomy, but the other is big data, which is, of course, a very hot topic. And radio astronomy generates enormous amounts of data. And so having clever and innovative ways with IT to handle that data and understand it is a key part of what Tara does. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Tara Murphy, who's going to talk to us today about the radio transient sky. The title of her talk is Extreme Events, Exploring the Radio Transient Sky. Please welcome Tara.
It's a privilege to be talking to you today. I had a very inspiring physics teacher myself at high school, and in fact it's a bit intimidating to talk to a room full of physics experts. So I thought, what could I give you in this talk that you don't already know? And I thought the thing I would really like to share is what it's like actually being a scientist right now in astrophysics. So this is a really exciting time in astrophysics. A lot of things are changing. We have amazing new technology that's really changing the way that we see the universe. And the research centre I work as part of here at the University of Sydney, called CAASTRO, the key thing that we do, the thing that's different to the past, is we want to study the universe using an all-sky view, using big data, using large surveys that enable serendipitous discoveries, but also allow us to look at the universe in a fairly unbiased way. So in the past, most astronomy was very targeted observations. Now, we can look at the sky in large, unbiased surveys and see what we find, also look at large populations of objects and help us understand, ultimately, of course, the physics that's going on in them. Now, my particular area of research is the transient sky. And this is something that has fascinated humans right back throughout our history. Our ancient ancestors, our indigenous ancestors, through to the early sort of dawn of science, people were always intrigued about things that changed rapidly on human timescales. So in this example, a historical diagram by Tycho Brahe of supernova 1572, the explosion was first observed by ancient astronomers as a new star appearing in the sky. They were, of course, very familiar where all the normal stars were, so when a new one appeared, this was a moment of great significance, and often it was given religious or other importance in various cultures around the world. When we look at that same spot now, we still see the shock from that supernova that was observed by those ancient astronomers. We still see it going out, interacting with the interstellar medium, and you can see here this X-ray image of that shock material that still exists today. It's called a supernova remnant. So transient astronomy is something that goes right back to the dawn of astronomy. And I think it's great that you can feel connected to our scientific ancestors when you look at something like a supernova remnant today. It goes right back there through the generations. So throughout this talk, I've also put, I guess, some links to the current Stage 6 syllabus, just in case you want to use any of these resources in connection to the syllabus points, but I'm not going to really discuss them explicitly. So why are these transient, variable, extreme events interesting? They're interesting because they basically give us a laboratory in space. Now, most of the way science is taught, there's the idea of sort of theoretical science that comes up with hypotheses, which then experimentalists construct experiments and try and verify or rule out. And then that's a feedback cycle that keeps going. Astronomy is a very interesting science because it's an observational science. We can't construct an astronomy experiment in the lab. We can't control the unknown parameters. But we construct a different type of experiment. We construct an observation experiment where we say, if we observe this in this way, will that allow us to say something interesting about the physics that's going on. And probably the best example of that, in a long time, but also that just happened to happen a few months ago, was of course the discovery of gravitational waves from two inspiraling 30 solar mass black holes by LIGO. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about this in the media. I'm not going to discuss it in detail. But when you think about this is something that was predicted just over 100 years ago, and it's taken decades of work to construct this type of observation. And then, once we've constructed that, you have to wait and hope the universe delivers. In this case, it delivered straight away. As soon as these instruments were turned on, we detected something that looked almost exactly like the predictions, okay? So this is an incredible bit of physics, but as astronomers, you can only construct and then, in a sense, wait in a passive way to see what's actually happening in the universe. So I like to think of transient events like this one. This is something that happens just as those black holes, just as they merge, that they cause these gravitational waves. I like to think of astronomy then as a laboratory, okay, where we can see extreme physics happening that is not able to test on Earth because the conditions are not right here. We couldn't have two 30 solar mass black holes here, obviously, hopefully not anywhere near Earth. So we have to do these experiments in space. So the area I work in, radio transients, what kind of processes cause things to change rapidly on human timescales? So to put it in context, remember that most things you see when you look up at the sky, galaxies, stars, very far from us, don't actually change an enormous amount on the timescales that we live. So for example, a massive galaxy evolves over millions of years. So if we look at it today, it looks almost exactly the same if we look at it in 50 years' time. These extreme events are the exception to that. And they happen, for example, when explosions happen, when stars get to the end of their life and go supernova. They might happen when, due to accretion on black holes, neutron stars. They might happen due to rotating pulsars. It might happen due to the interaction between a planet and its solar wind. And of course, there's always the possibility that it happens due to processes and objects we haven't yet discovered, okay? The so-called unknown unknowns, things that we hope to discover serendipitously. So there's a whole range of physical phenomena, a whole range of astronomical phenomena that fall under this area of research. So one of them, I'll just give you a couple examples, one of them is gamma ray bursts. So gamma ray bursts are extremely bright. In fact, when they happen in gamma ray, they are, at the moment they happen, the brightest objects in the universe. When a massive star dies, collapses, and goes supernova to form a black hole, in some cases, and we don't fully understand why, only in some cases, it emits two massive beams, very highly beamed radiation in gamma rays, which is extremely high energy radiation, and at a very, very narrow angle. So these jets come out of the central source here, and if they happen to be pointed towards Earth, we see them with a satellite as what's called a gamma ray burst. And this is the eye that's lined up here with this jet. If they happen to not be pointed towards Earth, we don't see them at all, and so they're essentially invisible. So we know about thousands of these objects. In fact, they were discovered in the 1950s and 60s when America was monitoring the anti-nuclear test ban treaty, and they were basically had satellites up there looking for gamma ray emission from Russians testing nuclear bombs. What they found was incredibly powerful gamma ray emission, but coming from space. And for a long time, the source of this emission was unknown. Future telescopes were able to detect what's called the afterglow. So as well as these extremely highly beamed jets, after that initial few milliseconds and seconds of radiation, this shock starts to interact with itself and with the interstellar medium, and you end up with what's called an afterglow, which is distributed much more isotropically. So then optical telescopes and radio telescopes at much longer wavelengths can actually detect the emission from these gamma ray bursts. And one of the great things that we might be able to do with radio astronomy, this is one of the things we're working on actively at the moment, is detect the hidden population of gamma ray bursts that are invisible to gamma ray telescopes because they don't happen to be pointing right towards Earth. By detecting with extremely sensitive radio telescopes the afterglow emission, we can basically reveal this completely invisible population. And that's what astronomy is all about, the astronomy bit, I guess. Once we know those objects are there, studying them in detail gives us access to the physics. So another example of the type of object we could detect with looking for variability and transient emission is planets. So a lot of people don't realize this, but Jupiter actually emits very strongly in the radio. Now this is an image of Jupiter at about 2 gigahertz taken with the Australia Telescope Compact Array. If you actually go to much lower frequencies, so right down to hundreds and tens of megahertz, then what you actually see is that when Jupiter flares due to the interaction of electrons in the solar wind, so from our sun, with Jupiter, which has a very strong magnetic field, about 10 times as strong as Earth, then you see emission that at the moment of the flare makes Jupiter as bright as the sun. So if you imagine that you were looking at our solar system from far away as an alien, looking back at our solar system, you would actually see temporarily the sun almost double in brightness if Jupiter was flaring. So in the last, I already mentioned gravitational waves, which is possibly the physics discovery of our time. The astronomy, I think, discovery of our time is extrasolar planets. So when I finished high school, we just discovered the first extrasolar planet. Before that, right up until the mid-1990s, the only planets we knew were in our own solar system. Since then, this area of astronomy has absolutely boomed. It's completely changed our view of the universe. And I know in the early stage 6 syllabus, there's something about our place in the universe where we look at how our star is only one of many stars and our galaxy is only one of many galaxies. When the syllabus is updated, I hope that it adds our planet is one of only many planets, because we now know that many of those stars, possibly even most stars, have planets around them. So the telescope Kepler has confirmed about 3,000 planets. Just in the last decade of work, we know this. So this has completely changed our view of the universe and our place in the universe. Now, where does radio astronomy come in? So far, most of these planets are detected in indirect ways. So we look at the wobble of the sun, of their sun, for example, caused by the gravitational attraction between the planet and their star. Some of them are detected directly, some of them can be imaged directly. But when you think about Jupiter, and you think about how when it's emitting at those low radio frequencies, it's actually as bright as the sun, it means that radio astronomy may be another method that we could detect extrasolar planets in a direct kind of imaging kind of way. So this is another exciting area of research that we're all working on right now. Tim Bedding's group is very much involved in Kepler and exoplanet discovery, but we're also looking at it from different angles, such as radio astronomy. So I feel like this is one of the big exciting things that's happened in science since I've been a scientist, is the discovery that there are so many planets around other stars. So I've mentioned radio astronomy a lot, but I haven't really talked about what it actually is. And I'm sure that most people here are aware of what radio astronomy is, but I just thought I'd recap a little bit and put it in the context of high school physics. So we all know that there's whole range here of the electromagnetic spectrum, from the high energy ends, such as gamma rays, which I mentioned, and X-rays, which largely blocked out, thankfully, by the Earth's atmosphere, and so we can't see them on Earth. The original astronomy was, of course, all optical, and it's not a coincidence that that the Earth lets through, obviously, optical light, and that our eyes are designed to see it, and that's how we first viewed the universe. But the other type of light, the other type of radiation that the Earth's atmosphere also lets through is radio waves. And after the development of radar in World War II, for the purposes of looking for enemy aircraft coming in over the horizon, a whole new area of astronomy boomed, and that was radio astronomy. Australia has been a leader in radio astronomy ever since then, through a combination of reasons, partly the way that we contributed to the original development of radar, partly because our geographic location and nature of our country, being not very densely populated, means that it's actually a great place to do radio astronomy. So what causes radio emission? If you want to get deep into the physics, this is the kind of thing you can go and read about. So there are a number of different processes that are going on in stars or galaxies or gas that actually cause radio waves to be emitted. One of the most common sources of radio emission is what's called synchrotron emission, which is when a charged particle, such as an electron, is accelerated in a magnetic field. Synchrotron emission is when that electron is highly relativistic. Cyclotron emission is when that electron is just traveling at non-relativistic speeds, but it's essentially the same process. When that happens, that emits radio waves. So for example, that image of Jupiter I showed you before is synchrotron emission from Jupiter because electrons are being accelerated in its magnetic field. Okay? And so when we look at the universe with a radio telescope, these are the kind of things that we're seeing. The important point is that it's largely not thermal emission, which is the cause of most of the optical and infrared kind of emission that you see. So it's investigating different physical processes. So a radio telescope, how do we actually detect radio emission? I know that often astronomy focuses on optical telescopes. Radio telescopes work quite differently. So the basic components are that you need an antenna. You need something to detect the radiation. Now remember, radio waves, of course, you know, are very long. So we're talking about wavelengths from centimeters to meters. And so generally you need an antenna that can detect long wavelengths, which means that you end up with a dish, something like this. The dish focuses the radio waves, and it also provides a collecting area on which to detect them. So you then need some kind of receiver and amplifier in your system that amplifies that signal to a level that you could actually detect it. And then that signal usually gets passed these days to a computer where it's correlated, processed, and so on, and then we analyze it. So this is an important aspect of the way astrophysics actually works now, is that most astronomers, whether they're optical or radio or X-ray astronomers, don't actually sit at a telescope. Most of us sit at a computer. And the reason is that our telescopes are either in space, in the case of TIM and Kepler, or they're radio telescopes in the middle of the desert, and our data is getting sent back to, for example, a supercomputing center. On the telescopes I work on, all the data is processed in a supercomputing center in Perth, and then to our own laptops. So the way we do science is very different than it used to be in the past. And as Tim mentioned, big data is a big factor. We're collecting lots of data, gigabytes of data every night, terabytes of data every night, and so processing that data almost becomes part of the telescope. One of the things people talk about a lot in radio astronomy is the idea of the software telescope. The telescope is just the front part of your system. The back part of your system is also the computer that you need and the software you need to make sense of the data. So what would we do what kind of telescope would be an ideal radio telescope for doing the kind of surveys that I want to do to look for variability and transients? Now, you know that in astronomy it's important to get high resolution images. So, and this of course connects directly to optics as well, but we're just doing it at a lower resolution than, at a lower frequency than with optical light. Okay, so it's the same principles. We need high resolution, and resolution is related to the wavelength of the light you're trying to observe and the diameter of your telescope, in our case. So what we want, we have very long wavelength light, okay, very low frequency, and so we need a very large diameter on our telescope. That means we need to build a big dish, simply. So we also want a large collecting area. We want to get the best sensitivity. So the more area on our dish, say, let's just assume it's a dish, that we have to collect radiation, the fainter signals that we can see. So to put this into perspective, all of the things that I'm talking about, when we talk about things like gamma ray bursts and so on, we talk about them like they're very energetic, they're very bright, okay? But actually, the signal you receive on Earth is tiny compared to the other signals that are around us. So if you're talking about a radio telescope, for example, someone on a mobile phone or someone using a microwave is producing a much greater signal than this distant radio galaxy or star or supernova or whatever we're trying to look at, okay? So we have to have a very sensitive telescope, which means a large collecting area. We also want, for this kind of big science, a large field of view. We want to be able to survey see as much of the sky at once. And that's simply so that we can do our observations more efficiently, do them faster. Obviously, if we can see a large section of sky and we want to, say, go and revisit it to see if anything has changed, it's helpful rather than if we had to do thousands of observations to make up the same region of sky, which is what used to happen in the past. So that's just a sort of a practicality. And then finally, we'd ideally like to be able to point in different directions so that we can do what's called tracking a source. So obviously, as the Earth rotates, the stars and the other astronomical objects move in relation to us, and we want to be able to follow them across the night or across the day so that we can observe them for a longer period of time, and hence also get better signal to noise on those sources. So this is very related to the syllabus, resolution and sensitivity of telescopes. It's just that most of the discussion on those topics is about optical telescopes, and I just like to show that it's just the same issues for radio telescopes. So if we want higher resolution, and why do we care about higher resolution? These objects are very tiny in angular size on the sky. And remember, higher resolution means that we can distinguish one tiny object from its neighbor. If we don't have that high resolution, so for example, I'm standing up here at the front, if I remove my glasses, the people at the back just blur into one person. I don't have enough resolution to distinguish between them, okay? So we want resolution so that we can see these individual objects. One thing we can do is just build a bigger dish. This is an example, the Arecibo telescope. The Arecibo radio telescope is just one giant 300 meter diameter dish, okay? Now this obviously has its limitations. You can imagine that it's hard to get much bigger than that, and you can also imagine that it's pretty impossible to build a telescope that big that you could also steer effectively, okay? So this is kind of as high as you can go if you follow that path. As an example of how it has its limitations, this is a well-known story of the collapse of the Green Bank telescope in the US, where, luckily it was kind of towards the end of its life anyway at this point, but you can see that there are just engineering limitations on how big a dish you would want to build for your telescopes. So what's the other solution? If we can't just build bigger and bigger dishes, then the other solution is interferometry. Again, this is a technique that's used in optical as well as in radio astronomy. And what we do is that rather than having a big dish that is kilometers wide, which is what we'd want, we have lots of little dishes. We separate them so there's gaps in our telescope, but we use this clever mathematical technique called Fourier transforms to join the information from all of those dishes together in a process called correlation, essentially, and then Fourier transforming, so that we end up with a telescope that's bigger than what it actually seems. So if we have short baselines, so this is telescopes that are close together, they give us information because the Fourier transform kind of gives us inverse, it has an inverse relationship to the spatial scale. They show us the large scale structure in our objects. If we have telescopes that are far apart, many kilometers apart, that gives us information on tiny scales in our objects. Combining all that information together, we end up with a picture of the sky that's not quite the same as if we had, as in the case of the Australia Telescope Compact Array here, a 6 kilometre, the furthest dishes are 6 kilometres apart. So this is like having a 6 kilometre diameter dish that just has a few gaps in it. So interferometry, this is the key kind of technology behind almost all modern radio astronomy of the type that I'm talking about. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the square kilometre array, And this is the era of radio astronomy that we're entering into. So the Square Kilometre Array is a telescope that's still being planned. It's been being planned for my entire lifetime, I think, and it will probably be being planned for the rest of my career. But on the way to the Square Kilometre Array, one of the things we're doing is building telescopes to test the technology and the science that we could do with the Square Kilometre Array, and there's already exciting science that is coming out of those test instruments. So this telescope, if and when it's built, will be many times better than our existing radio telescopes, both in resolution and sensitivity and survey speed. So this is a telescope that's designed to see as much of the sky as possible, as often as possible, at as high resolution and the faintest source as possible. So it's basically your ideal radio telescope that we just designed. So there's two telescopes that I'm working on at the moment in Australia. Both of these are located in the Western Australian desert. One is called the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder. This is an instrument that looks pretty much like your traditional telescopes, but it has some very cool instrumentation that make it a bit different, and it operates around a gigahertz frequencies. So this is currently been commissioned, and in fact, Rob and I are just heading off after, well, sometime later today to go to the conference elsewhere on campus about doing science with ASCAP. So this is a telescope we're about to start doing science on at the end of this year. The other telescope, which is testing technology at the other end of the frequency spectrum, so this is low frequency, around 100 to 300 megahertz, is the Murchison Widefield Array. This doesn't look like a typical telescope. This looks like a kind of robot army of antennas in the desert. So there are many tiles of these. This is like one dish, and then there are many of those dishes spread over the desert, kilometers apart, that we combine just like I described for a dish-based interferometer. And these are the telescopes that I'm working on at the moment, sort of doing some of the precursor science to the Square Kilometre Array. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes, I just wanted to talk about an example of the kind of science that you can do, serendipitous discovery, that just happened to be made by a student working with me a couple of years ago, a very brilliant student, but it brings together all the different threads, astronomy as a laboratory, extreme events as a laboratory, the data, the big data that we have to use to process these things, and the way that by designing unbiased surveys of the sky, you can discover things that you weren't actually looking for. So, just to very briefly tell you how we normally look for radio transients, one of the ways we look is we take a radio image of the sky. Now, unlike the incredible images you've seen from optical telescopes, like David Malan images and so on, in radio astronomy, it's actually pretty boring. So each of these black dots on this image is a distant radio galaxy. Each of these has a supermassive black hole at the center that's causing the emission that you see as one of those little black dots, okay? This is what radio astronomers do. We look at those little images of black dots all day and try and figure something out about the universe and about physics. It's pretty tricky. They kind of all look the same. Okay, so we take an image like that, and then we want to revisit that patch of sky many times and see if anything has changed. That's obviously simplifying it right down. I wouldn't need to have done a PhD if that was all that was there. But that's essentially what we do, okay? And so what happens when we do that is most of the time, like I said, nothing changes. So a couple of years ago, we were working with the Murchison Widefield Array with its early data, and we'd noticed, one of the postdoctoral researchers on the team noticed that some nights, when she looked at the data, she happened to find some very bad data. So this is looking every 2 minutes at this same patch of sky, and you can see that these sources are moving a lot. Now, distant radio galaxies can't possibly be moving on these kind of scales. This would be like the only thing you could see moving something like that is like a planet, like Jupiter, for example, going across our images, or the moon going across our images, or a satellite, or something like that. Those things move on timescales of minutes, but distant radio galaxies, they don't move on timescales of minutes. So what's causing this problem? This is caused by the ionosphere, the Earth's ionosphere, which is the ionized kind of layer around the top of our atmosphere it protects the Earth, And it also interacts with the solar wind, which is what actually ionizes it, okay, which is what ionizes that gas. Now, we knew the ionosphere was going to be a problem at low frequencies. Most astronomers at higher frequencies, they could just ignore the ionosphere. Even high-frequency radio astronomers, which is the rest of my career until this point that I started working with the MWA, you just ignore it, so it's not a problem. But people had told us it's going to be a problem, and then Natasha came across this image with all these wiggling sources, and we thought, this is a real problem, okay? So I had a new student, an honours student called Cleo, and I said to her, a good project would be try and work out how much of a problem it is for my transient and variable imaging. So I want you to calculate how much does the ionosphere typically make the radio sources move, okay? And let us know whether this is going to be an issue. So it seemed like a fairly straightforward project, although no one had really done it before. Every conference I went to, people just throwing around these, the ionosphere is going to be a problem, but no one had really quantified it. Quantifying things is obviously one of the things that you do as a physicist. So I set her this project, and she came up with a clever technique where she thought, we can actually use all these background objects as if they're kind of lights shining through the ionosphere. So what we'll do is we look at them. In an MWA image, we see thousands of radio galaxies that, remember, typically don't change at all. So what she did was just have the idea to plot the way their position changed with time as we went through the night. So she came up with these little arrows, she got an image of the sky, she found the average position of each object during her observations, and then she represented the change in position from the average position, actually the median position, by these little arrows. And initially, it didn't look that interesting. And then she just thought, why don't I make the arrows that are pointing one way blue and the arrows that are largely pointing the other way red and see what it looks like. And so, surprisingly, no one had actually done this before. So this is the technique that she came up with as a student. And I thought that, some of you have probably seen this before, but I thought that I would just let Cleo actually describe the project in her own words. So I'll just play this little video.
Due to its molten iron core, the Earth has a magnetic field around it, just like a bar magnet. This magnetic field extends outwards into space, forming a big bubble that we call the magnetosphere. The inner layer of the magnetosphere, from near the Earth's surface up to 1,000 or so kilometers, is called the ionosphere because it is made up of particles ionized via radiation from the sun. In low-frequency radio astronomy, when we point our telescopes to the sky to measure the faint signals that travel through space to reach us, we need to take structures and perturbations in the ionosphere into account that might change these signals. We need a good understanding of the effects of the ionosphere to make sense of our data. Pictured near the surface, the Earth's magnetic field lines run parallel and come out at an angle to the ground. It has long been postulated that tubular plasma structures go along the magnetic field lines, and it is structures like these that can affect our astronomical measurements. Previously, people could only guess what they might look like, since no one has ever been able to image them. My name is Cleo Loy, and I am an astrophysics student with CAASTRO at the University of Sydney. I have found that we can use a new type of radio telescope to not only detect these plasma tubes in the ionosphere, but to actually image them. And what's more, we can reconstruct their behavior in real time and in 3D. This is a very exciting world's first. The Murchison Widefield Array, or MWA for short, is a radio telescope in the Western Australian desert. It consists of 128 receiver tiles, spread over a circular area roughly 3 kilometers across, that work together as one instrument. What makes it so special is its huge field of view, letting us observe a large patch of sky and all sorts of celestial objects as they flash or pass overhead. We use the MWA to study how the ionosphere shifts around the observed positions of objects in the sky and distorts them. A good analogy for this is the way lights at the bottom of a swimming pool dance around when the water ripples. We cannot see the water directly because it is transparent, but from the dancing lights we can determine the pattern of the ripples at its surface. Just like when we are looking at an angle down parallel train tracks, if you were standing at the site of the MWA, the Earth's magnetic field lines would appear to converge. What we saw with the MWA was a stunning distortion pattern that strongly coincided with the magnetic field lines. For the first time, we revealed the true nature of these structures as a vast array of plasma tubes, filling the sky in staggering numbers. The MWA's rapid snapshot capabilities allow us to make movies showing their motions over time. But that's not all. The MWA also has the power to see in 3D. When we look at an object, our brain combines the images from our two eyes, allowing us to judge how far away it is. So by analysing the signals recorded by MWA tiles in the east, separate to tiles in the west, we give the MWA the ability to perceive depth. This has never been done with a radio telescope before. By using the MWA like a pair of eyes, the three-dimensional nature of the tubes springs into reality. We can measure their heights above the ground, see their steep inclination, and watch as they drift sideways towards or away from the MWA. This is a whole new way of looking at the sky.
Okay, so this was something that was done very impressively by an undergraduate student and had a big impact around the world. There's a few things I'd like to highlight about this discovery. Okay, so firstly, it takes the innovation of having a multi-million-dollar telescope that has not existed before. So we could do this type of observation. But the really interesting thing that got astronomers interested in this is that what may not be apparent from the outside is that different areas of science, even within an area of science that seems quite similar, like astronomy and space science, which is the people that study the ionosphere, we're actually quite separate communities. And as established scientists, most people from those communities don't actually interact that much. The interesting thing about Cleo is that she was doing her degree here, doing an undergraduate course on space science and the ionosphere with one of our other professors here, and then she was working on this research project with me. And so without these preconceptions of an established scientist, she didn't think there was anything weird about obviously taking a radio telescope and using it to study something that was just above us, the ionosphere. And so things like the fact that she used the telescope to calculate the parallax distance to the ionosphere. Well, she didn't fully know that what we were seeing was actually the ionosphere when she saw it. And so she was thinking, how could we establish its distance? Because if we knew its distance, we would know it was the ionosphere. People ask, why had no one ever used a radio telescope like that before? How did a student think of that when all of you are working on this kind of thing all the time? It's a very simple answer. Radio astronomers never use parallax. Parallax, remember, is only useful when you're calculating the distance of up to a few hundred parsecs. And so everything that I study, for example, is megaparsecs away. You wouldn't even, parallax is completely useless. So we would never think of doing that. So Cleo, sitting there, I remember at a cafeteria at a conference over at Macquarie Uni, suddenly said, oh, if we split the telescope in two, we could combine the signal from that side and the signal from that side and use it to calculate the distance with parallax. And everyone was like, wow, no one had thought of that because we're radio astronomers and that's not the type of way we would normally use our instrument. So it was an incredible combination of a great new telescope, an extremely talented student, who was able to kind of bring together scientists in two completely different areas. So when Cleo originally saw these lines in the data, and she sent an email around, when we'd done our own internal debugging over a number of days, she sent an email around to the MWA Collaboration, which is a mailing list of hundreds of scientists from all over the world. She was quite intimidated about doing that as an undergrad. People were so excited that over the weekend, I think she sent the email on Saturday, she came into work on Monday, very stressed about how many people had replied to her email because everyone had started sending in ideas about what might be wrong. And of course, they were all using their radio astronomy knowledge of the telescope to suggest problems, but no one thought of checking something like, is it aligned with the Earth's geomagnetic field? Because we don't work on the Earth's geomagnetic field. It didn't occur to us. And so it was a really great story. I thought I'd show that in case you're looking for resources in the classroom about, a discovery that was also by a student. So a really great discovery that uses actually really basic physics. That's the nice thing about this. Things like parallax are extremely accessible, very easy to explain. And basically, she's traveled around the world talking about this. In fact, the US Department of Defense even invited her over to talk to them about the discovery because of its implications for radar communication. So it was a really interesting story. And Cleo's now gone on to do her PhD. I'm sure she'll discover great things in the future. But it's also an example of how this came from data analysis, looking at doing these things on a large scale that we wouldn't have been able to see before. If you want to know more about the story, we wrote an article about it for the conversation, so that's also something that some of your students might be interested in reading, the kind of behind-the-scenes look at how science actually works. Okay, so I want to wrap up just with a summary of, I guess, the message I'm hoping to get across, which is that firstly, astronomy is more than just looking at the sky and seeing interesting things. It's actually using space as a laboratory to study extreme physics. So looking at extreme objects allows us to study physics that we can't study on Earth in the same way because the conditions aren't right. The new telescopes across all the different wavebands, I've concentrated on radio because that's what I work on. One of the features of new telescopes is large survey science creating big data that needs to be analysed in clever ways to find those interesting needles in a haystack that you can do this interesting science with. So almost every astronomer I know spends most of their time coding, processing data, sitting at a computer analysing things, using a lot of maths, using a lot of sort of computational thinking to try and solve problems. So if you have students that are interested in that side of things, this is what modern science is like. This is what most of us spend most of our time doing. I think two of the big discoveries of our time that excite me most about astrophysics, one, of course, gravitational waves this year, likely to win the Nobel Prize. A lot of Australians involved in that, both in the original discovery and also in the follow-up of objects. This is just the very beginning of a new area of astrophysics. When we can actually get more sensitive detections of gravitational waves, we will potentially discover new astronomical objects. We will be able to test relativity in different ways. So this is a whole new window that's opening up, okay, right now. And this is just the very beginning. The discovery I think is most exciting about if people say, you know, what's happened since I learned about science to since I'm doing science, I think the discovery of exoplanets. It's got such big implications for the way we see our place in the universe, the likelihood of there being other life in the universe, and I think that it's difficult to even comprehend that until only a couple of decades ago, we thought we were the only solar system. Now it turns out we're probably not that special after all. To me, that's similar to when our scientific ancestors discovered that our star was not that special and our galaxy was not that special. And now we probably know that our solar system is not that special either. So this is, I think, a profound thing. And the other thing I wanted to just let you know about, in case you weren't familiar with the history of radio astronomy in Australia, it's something we've always been world leaders in. We've got incredible telescopes here. We've got incredible new telescopes being built. And this is really a new era. To excite your students about being able to contribute in this, this is something that's happening right now and will, for the next few decades, be a new area of astrophysics. So that's where I'd like to end. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also happy for you to email me. I've got lots of extra resources that I couldn't include in this talk. I won't be around for the rest of this conference because I have to go to the ASCAP conference to talk about the exciting new science that we're doing. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tara. Questions for Tara? Les.
Tara, excellent talk, excellent talk. One comment. The work of Cleo is really tremendous. I was just wondering, are they knowing too much science can actually be an impediment to discovery? It's a new way of looking at things. You're not going down the same channels all the time and thinking like other people are. So I think the youngsters, the under 25s, make very profound discoveries.
I think, yes. So I think I'd just like to add one important caveat, because as you know, we do have quite a lot of people contact us who sort of along the lines of, I've discovered something new about relativity that no one's ever known before. And that's, I wouldn't like people to think that not knowing much allows you to discover. What I would say what you said is true, with the caveat that you have to actually know enough of the foundations to be able to see something different on top of them. And so Cleo had an incredible knowledge. She's one of the best students we've had. She had an incredible knowledge of space and solar physics and of the astrophysics behind these things from her extensive reading. And then on top of that, she wasn't hindered by our established ways of thinking, yes. So she was able to bring those thoughts together. So yes, I agree with you, just with the caveat that she did actually know quite a lot about the basics. Yeah.
We've got another question up there.
Hi, Tara. Question that I imagine a Year 12 student would ask. If you could put a big radio telescope in space, so without the engineering constraints of putting it on Earth, would the results you get be better than using a array on Earth?
Well, yes. So actually, there has been many proposals over the years, and one of my colleagues in the US wants to roll out a radio telescope on the moon. So firstly, there's a few reasons why it would be better. The atmosphere and the ionosphere, as you've seen, they do affect our radio observations. If you can get above that, then just like a gamma ray telescope in space or an optical telescope in space, if you can get above our atmosphere and our ionosphere, then you remove one whole set of problems. The other thing, so you said, would you rather put one in space than have an interferometer? I would say I'd rather have an interferometer in space. So one of the plans that's being proposed, although who knows if it would ever get funded, would be to have one node of our radio telescope on the moon and others on Earth, so that your baseline, the maximum distance between them, is absolutely huge. So the resolution that you could see would be brilliant compared to anything we could do on Earth. So absolutely. I mean, if you want to look up, the name has just escaped me, but if you look up Lunar Radio Telescope, you'll see this plan to have little robots roll out a kind of aluminium foil kind of thing on the surface of the moon to be a radio telescope. It's an awesome idea. So, yeah.
We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if people put their hands up, we can just be ready with the time.
Thank you for another talk. Question about the future of funding for research, because obviously like the Brian Schmidt's group's discovery of Wi-Fi and so forth, this discovery that's here. The issue of, I suppose, venture capital and innovation, I know America kind of is forward thinking of this. How do you see it evolving here for physics students and entrepreneurs and that sort of thing?
Do you mean venture capital in specifically for astronomy, or just broadly in science innovation?
Science innovation, so the area of physics, it seems like we've got these technologies and thinking that's sort of going ahead, but...
I mean, I certainly think that in Australia, it's been an area although we have some great success stories, I would say that it hasn't been an area that we've really excelled in, converting basic technology, which I think we're very good at, into commercialized sort of, versions. That's something that Australia hasn't necessarily been amazing at. I think that's for a few reasons, one of which is just our community is much smaller. The amount of money in Australian industry, of course, is smaller than compared to the US. But I also think it's about our attitude to commercialization, which, of course, has just been a bit different to what it's like in the States. And I'm not saying that's actually a bad thing. I mean, I think basic research in astronomy in Australia is actually reasonably well funded. We have had a very strong history of astronomy in Australia. We have a lot of excellent, achievements, and we've had quite good support from many governments on both sides of politics over the years. So, what would I say about a student who wanted to go into something that might be related to innovation? I would say, look at this building we're in right now, this nanoscience hub, okay? This is all about technology that can be converted to something commercial. This is absolutely the kind of thing that they could get involved in. And I think there's a growing entrepreneurial scene in Australia, certainly in IT, in tech. There's a lot of students who are giving startups a go. I would say that they can upskill themselves, get coding, learn how to create the solutions themselves, and then they can try and get involved in that. I mean, it's certainly increasing in Australia right now, both in physics, as we see here in nanoscience, and also in IT. So I think it's improving, yeah.
Quickly jumping, Brian Schmidt's fantastic. He won the Nobel Prize, but the Wi-Fi here was John O'Sullivan.
Oh yes, sorry, I forgot to pick up on that. Yeah, so Wi-Fi was CSIRO with John O'Sullivan.
Yeah, the Nobel Prize, you get credit for everything, I think.
Other questions?
Just a question I'll ask. With all these new radio telescopes being brought on with the SKA and everything, is there still a role for things like the dish and narrowbody?
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm sure you've seen in the media recently the discussion about funding of existing CSIRO facilities and new facilities. One thing that's really... So obviously, firstly, there's a limited amount of government funding available for anything, and so it's not unreasonable that choices are made in the science community about which things should be funded. Having said that, one of the things that's blurry from the outside that people don't realise is these telescopes are actually very different. So in the incredible sales pitch that we might give you for ASCAP or the MWA, actually they do quite a different type of science than Parkes and the Australia Telescope Compact Array. And it's hard to explain briefly, but for example, what Parkes does in the discovery of pulsars and more recently fast radio bursts is completely different from anything that ASCAP and MWA will do. So, with a scientist hat on, of course there's an enormous role. They're very different instruments, we use them for different things. With a politics hat on, of course there's a limited amount of money and difficult choices might have to be made, and I think that's something that right now is a big topic of discussion in the astronomy community.
Hi, thank you. I was very excited about your speech.
Thanks.
First of all, I have to say that I was also excited that two of the physicists you mentioned were females, Natasha and Cleo,
Yes.
and my teacher at Coastal. And on that note, how do I get, not just girls, boys, students, as a physics teacher, how do I get them to become like you? What do I do in the classroom to push them into, not making necessarily astrophysics, but just into,
Well, one of the things that, I can't fully answer that question, obviously. My own story, I've always been very interested in science, although it wasn't specifically physics at school. I did enjoy physics. I actually came to university thinking that I would do biology, but found physics more interesting when I got to university. So I think I've always had a general interest in science, and so I'm not sure I can answer the question about people that aren't interested. For people that are interested, I think one of the things about the way physics and maths often come across is that they come across being a lot about technical things and technology and almost engineering type of things. And I have to say, maybe as a woman physicist, that those things have never interested me. Oh, I know this is being recorded, so none of my telescope friends, please judge me on this. I just don't find telescopes that interesting. Oh no. No, they're brilliant, aren't they? No, of course they're brilliant, but I have never been one of those people that's in there, doing those things you do in the lab. I think it's important to make sure people realise, particularly girls, that physics is not all about cars and space rockets and trucks and stuff like that, which naturally come up when you're talking about mechanics and dynamics and so on. It's also about things like doing science with these big collaborations. It's like the wonder of the universe. It's like understanding our place in the universe, whether there's life on other planets. To me, these are human questions. That's always what I've been more interested in. So if I'm telling the story of science, having said that, I'm actually mainly a software I do computational kind of science, and that I do find fascinating. But I think that we should try and communicate it so that it's not always about the toys and the engineering and the tools. Because there's a lot of us in science these days that actually have very little to do with those things. Yeah.
Perhaps I can quickly add also, it's also about helping people, and perhaps not so much astronomy, but there are other parts of physics. So the nanoscience work here, a lot of that is how to cure cancer. Make nanoparticles. There's a lab just behind this building where they inject nanodiamonds and do MRI on them, and they go to tumours and they image them. So it's actually not, as Tara said, it's not just about making clever things, it's actually about helping people. And I think for everyone, but particularly perhaps for young women, that might be something that's attractive.
Yeah,
that's what my question was relating to. Practical real-life problems. I was just wondering if radio astronomy connects with maybe life on Mars or life in space, or using these radio bursts, quasar bursts, energy bursts to advance something on Earth.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe science that connects to that.
Sure, so there's two aspects to that question. The whether it connects to life on Mars aspect and the technology transfer, I guess. So related to life on other planets and so on, just in the paper maybe yesterday or the day before, there were some new images of Jupiter, radio images, which showed ammonia under the ammonia gas under the giant red spot and under the Jupiter atmosphere. So radio astronomy absolutely is connected to the challenge of finding life in space. Some of the markers of life on other planets are the effect that life has on the atmosphere of those planets. So, the molecules that photosynthesis produces and so on, radio astronomy can detect those molecules in space. So once all the new solar systems that we've discovered, once we can see them with sensitive enough radio telescopes, we'll be able to detect water in the atmospheres. That will be a sign that life is possible. We'll be able to detect complex molecules that may show that there's processes going on that we understand to be related to life. So on that side of things, absolutely radio astronomy is important in looking for life in the universe. On the how is it useful to the rest of society question, I would say that obviously astronomy, I personally think it's important from a cultural point of view of trying to understand our place in the universe, but most people when they ask that question they really mean, but what practical application does it actually have in society? And to that I'd say it's the technology transfer. So a lot of the telescopes that you see, the radio telescopes, also infrared telescopes and so on, have actually been designed based on technology that feeds back into other applications. Now I hate to use defense as a first example because I know that's a bit, some people don't feel good about that, but I talked to you about gamma ray bursts. That technology loop there with monitoring nuclear testing and astronomy was, you know, very tightly connected. In astronomy, someone already mentioned, in radio astronomy, someone already mentioned Wi-Fi. Again, that comes out of that kind of technology of thinking about how to observe these distant galaxies. So it's really about the fact that the engineering that we need to produce these telescopes and the engineering we need to do other things on Earth are related. And so developing those things, pushing the boundaries can help. So that's kind of how that connects.
So I'll add to that a bit. So a lot of the technology then feeds into medical diagnostic tools as well.
Yes.
So you actually design things in basic sciences for other applications, and that feeds into, and it's not only the technology, but it's how you deal with the big data.
Yes.
So with medical imaging and so on, there's huge data. With climate change, there's huge data. With national security about food shortages and so on, there's huge data out there as well. So it's the data type thing that maps onto solving other big picture problems. And unless you refine those tools and techniques, both instrumental, data management and so on, for specific things, you don't know how far you can push the barriers. So you push the barriers with these things and then apply them in other contexts.
Yes, in fact, that's a really good point. One very specific example of that is actually one of my friends at CSRO when we were working there, and she was looking at, similar to me, how to find astronomical objects in images. She now has a startup company in medical imaging related work where she's looking at whether you could rotate bodies when you're doing radiation therapy rather than rotating the radiation devices. And she actually came to me about a year ago to talk about the source finding algorithms we used in astronomy and whether they could be adapted for this kind of medical imaging challenge. So that is definitely an area where there's direct applicability.
Hi, Tara.
Hi.
Just you mentioned a big part of what you do is analysing big data.
Yep.
How important do you think it is that our students are getting access to skills in coding and computational thinking?
Oh, I mean, so with my other hat on, I actually teach coding to high school students, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is. I mean, to me, computational thinking is just something that's been missing from our education system for too long now, and it fits in there. I wouldn't say every student, well, I would say that every student would benefit from it, but every student that's doing maths, physics, chemistry, these things that are leading into big science, absolutely. It's a way of solving problems. It's not just about actually people think IT is about just using computers and so on. But this is about when you've got big data, you actually have to think about how to solve your problems in a computational way. Otherwise, you can't solve them. It's not just a matter of taking some analytic solution you've come up with a paper and pencil and then translating it to a computer, which is what that used to be in science. Now, there are many of my colleagues that do all of their science through computational methods. There isn't an analytic solution. So organising data and processing the data, I couldn't emphasize it enough. I think every student should be doing coding at school, yes.
What kind of codes would you recommend? Like, is it still mainly Python in science, or is it moving?
Yeah, well, I would say that the first answer is it doesn't actually matter. It's the way of thinking about solving problems that's important, the way of thinking about algorithms rather than a specific language. But if you want me to name a specific language, the languages used in astronomy are Python, C, broader in physics, MATLAB. They're languages that, on the one hand, things like C allow you to do really hardcore processing on a supercomputer very effectively. On the other hand, things like Python and MATLAB allow you to solve problems more quickly if they don't require that kind of high performance angle. So Python is the most common language used in astronomy worldwide at the moment, for sure. Legacy code is mostly still in C, but if you ask astronomers what language they're actually typing at their computer, it's Python. But I try to encourage students not to get caught up on the language. It's about learning to solve problems. You know, it's like mathematical thinking. Computational thinking is sort of an extension of that. It's a way of thinking rather than the specific language you're doing it in. Yeah.
Other questions?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tara. Thanks.